Come closer. I want to talk to you. I'm going to tell you an astounding story.
Greetings from the true crime wing of Perchance to Read. I've got a rare underground story of the true crimes of a Los Angeles summer in 1945 that mysteriously went on for over a year that I'm going to tell you about. So yes, although it's rarely talked about, this true crime spree caught the attention of Hollywood, and they made the 1948 cult noir classic He Walked by Night based on this spree. From Eagle Lion Films, He Walked by Night stars Richard Basehart, Whit Bissell, and a cast of actors who weren't household names, and I'll explain why that is in a moment. It actually makes a lot of sense. Like any movie based on fact, He Walked by Night takes artistic license as it depicts these true crimes, so happily this video is not a big fat spoiler for this fantastic movie. Let's get right to it. So we know old Hollywood, bubbling up as a new industry with fresh stories flowing, still scoured books, short stories, and magazine articles for ideas they turned into some of the best movies ever. They even hired famous writers to gin up great scripts. Occasionally, though, they ripped the stories right from the headlines even back then, and that's how one of the top, most culty noir films ever got made. As an art piece, the movie has everything you need in a 1940s noir: Los Angeles in the dark, dogged police, one or two tireless investigators, a solitary man on the run. So whose true crimes inspired He Walked by Night? Most people agree that his did. That's William Erwin Walker, aka Machine Gun Walker. On his end, he went by Erwin Walker. To be clear, before we go on, I'm neither glorifying nor judging Walker. Due Process had the final word on Walker, and I'll let those books stand. This is just a bit of history from 80 years ago, what happened and how it led to a film that, arguably, broke lots of ground for all modern police procedural films and television. If you enjoy Law and Order, CSI, NCIS, and the like, you can partially thank He Walked by Night. So back to the real life in the 1940s, what did Walker do to end up portrayed on the big screen by Richard Basehart? Well, in 1945, Walker was blending in well with Los Angeles society when he went on a year-and-a-half-long crime spree that started with rampant theft, selling stolen goods, and countless brazen robberies, and it ended in multiple shootings and a murder. He did it pretty much unchecked because, well, he blended in. And how he blended in is one for, apparently, the movies. So who is Walker? Well, by all available accounts, Walker had an average childhood. He was born in Glendale, California in 1917. If you know Glendale, you know it's a pleasant California neighborhood that's adjacent to Los Angeles. Most would say it's always been a lovely place to live. Check out this postcard from 1910 depicting Pasadena, which butts right up against Glendale. They're basically and arguably one big neighborhood. Eventually it turned into this. Walker's dad was a Los Angeles County flood control engineer, and his uncle was a prominent LA lawyer and chief deputy district attorney who eventually became a judge. Walker was interested in radio work and enjoyed sports. After he graduated high school, he spent a year at California Institute of Technology, aka Caltech. He then worked for the Glendale Police Department as a radio operator. It appears that at the time he lived with his parents and sister and was reportedly gentle, affectionate, and considerate, and was basically no bother to anyone. He seemed to be on a traditional path one might travel on their way to an ordinary life, maybe even an extraordinary one filled with rewards. So what happened? In 1941, Walker was still on a regular path. Remember, he didn't begin his crime spree until 1945. But in 1941, he joined the military and served as a lieutenant in the South Pacific during World War II. He was assigned to a group engaged in radar repair. The Army stationed him in Australia, but he eventually spent from June to November of 1944 on Wake Island. Most say that this is where his life took its first hard turn, because it was on Wake Island where Walker reportedly witnessed countless gruesome deaths and experienced prolonged exposure to broad-scale mortality. From Wake Island, Walker moved to Leyte Island, where he oversaw the safety of 85 men. One day he returned to his ship on orders and didn't post a guard detail for the men who remained behind. This proved to be a grave error. The next day, Walker left his ship and went back to the campsite and learned that many of his fellow servicemen had been killed in a surprise attack. His best friend survived the attack but was paralyzed from the neck down, although there's some confusion around this point because it appears at one point Walker was told his friend had died. but he also later reported having a conversation with this same friend sometime after the war. Even though Walker and others in charge on Leyte Island were cleared of any lapse in duty surrounding the attack, and Walker was reportedly well liked by the men who worked with him, he always blamed himself for the attack and his friend's injuries. Walker's mental processing of his friend's fate reportedly factored heavily into Walker's crimes. Not the friend himself, but just the way Walker handled or didn't handle well what happened. It added to his mental downward spiral. He spent 3 more days in battle, but he felt he was no longer fit to serve as an officer. The Army released him from active duty in December 1944 and sent him back to the States around March of 1945. So this is some footage of 1940s Burbank, another suburb adjacent to Los Angeles. Like Pasadena, from this postcard I showed you, Burbank also butts up against Glendale, where Walker grew up, and is so similar to Glendale the boundaries are pretty seamless. The architecture, the trees, and the landscaping are representative of a lot of LA suburbs. And I love how among all these long, wide streets there are no traffic lights and close to no stop signs. If you're watching this video at all, I assume you like vintage footage, so I'm just going to let this roll for a bit while I tell you what happened next with Walker. Also, while I love showing footage of historical places, I don't want to attempt to reenact Walker's crimes with footage that mimics real-life events. So I'll just keep 1940s Burbank, Glendale in the backdrop for a bit as I walk you through Walker's crime spree. And don't forget, He Walked by Night is out there for the viewing. I'll leave the dramatization to the experts. By July 1945, Walker was still on active duty in the Army and was even promoted. Remember, he was back home, but he was still in the Army. And his temperament had visibly changed after he left Leyte Island and returned to the States. He was about to kick his life of crime into gear, starting with nonviolent crimes. While he was still on active duty, and before that July 1945 promotion, Walker burglarized a garage and stole some tools, a voltmeter, and a radio tuner. By August 1945, again while still on active duty, he broke into an Army ordnance warehouse and stole 6 Thompson machine guns, 12 .45 automatics, 6 .38 revolvers, ammunition, holsters, and clips. The Army discharged Walker in November of 1945. Within a week, he stole an automobile, changed its license plates, and used the car to transfer some of the stolen goods. He stole amplifiers, electronic equipment, records, a projector, a recording turntable, a camera, and other equipment from record and film companies. Remember, it was Los Angeles, where the film and recording industries thrived, and this kind of equipment would have been everywhere in the city. And he never went back to his family. They said when he got home he was morose, taciturn, brooding, melancholy, secretive, and even rough with small children. He quit several jobs and turned down the chance to go back to his job with the Glendale Police Department, and he started carrying around a machine gun on a pretty regular basis. He operated out of a garage he rented and committed a dozen or so acts of burglary, armed robbery, and safe cracking for property he later sold, which netted him $70,000 at the time, even while he still had other stolen property on hand. To give you an idea, that $70,000 would be $1,186,535 in 2023. Walker continued on his run of committing crimes, but by April 1946, the police were onto him. Based on what he was stealing and selling, all that recording and film equipment, they figured out the next place he planned to sell stolen goods and they staked it out. They turned out to be right. When Walker arrived to make the deal, 2 detectives confronted him. The confrontation erupted into a shootout. Walker wounded one officer, and the other officer shot and wounded Walker. But Walker got away, even though he was shot. And how he got away is likely what grabbed Hollywood. Walker literally headed for the gutters in the street, squeezed into the opening for the storm drains, dropped into the drain, and ran for it through the tall labyrinth sewer system under Los Angeles. That's right, he ran through LA's sewers to get away. He made it far enough and knew his way around down there well enough to pop up and out somewhere else in the city, and he evaded capture. While the police presumably hoped to chase him down on the streets, knowing he was shot and wounded and couldn't move fast, he pushed ahead steadily for his life underground. He managed to make it home and tend to his gunshot wound on his own. By the way, the movie does a wonderful job with this bit of Walker's world. That alone makes it worth watching it. So Walker's first brush with dying for his crimes or getting caught was in April 1946 after that shootout with police. Fast forward a bit to the point of no return. In the early morning hours of June 5th, 1946, Walker, who was 28 years old by then and about to turn 29 in October, planned to rob a safe in a meat market at the corner of Los Feliz Boulevard and Brunswick Avenue in Glendale. In the process of scoping out the market, Walker cut the lock on the store, replaced it with his own lock, ditched the bolt cutter, and drove around the block a couple of times to see if anyone had spotted him, eventually retrieving the bolt cutter. At this point, the story hits a very wide fork in the road. Walker says while circling back to the store, he spotted someone in a car with a flashlight near where he had ditched the bolt cutter. According to Walker, the person called him to the car, and Walker approached the car on foot and recognized that the person behind the wheel was a police officer. The officer asked Walker for his identification and asked him why he was in the neighborhood. Walker said he was visiting his girlfriend and gently pulled out a .45 gun. The officer went for his gun, but Walker was faster and shot the officer twice. Walker claimed the officer asked him to call for help, and Walker said no. Walker also sort of implied that the officer shot at him first. So that was his version of events. The officer Walker shot was California Highway Patrol Officer Lauren Cornwell Roosevelt. The 43-year-old had once been the police chief in Arcadia, California, another Los Angeles adjacent city. He said while returning home in the early morning hours of June 5th, 1946, he spotted a car speeding on Los Feliz Boulevard and chased it. The car eventually slowed, and when Officer Roosevelt pulled alongside it, the driver of the other car, Walker, fired a gun multiple times. This aligns with Walker saying he circled the block to see if anyone had spotted him cutting the lock off the store. It's plausible and easy to imagine that he drove fast while making that circle in a rush each time to get back to the front of the store to see what went on. Meanwhile, remember how Walker said he shot Officer Roosevelt twice? The next day, the newspapers reported that Roosevelt had been hit by 9 .45 caliber bullets, making it likely, the reports said, this isn't my theory, that Walker opened fire on Roosevelt from his car with a Thompson machine gun, which supports Roosevelt's account. Where both stories are oddly substantiated is how Walker got away, which was, you guessed it, for the second time that we know of, Walker escaped a crime scene through the gutters, storm drains, and sewers of Los Angeles. In his own words, after he shot Roosevelt, he headed straight for the sewers, which means he abandoned at the scene the car he had been driving as he scoped out the store on Los Feliz Boulevard. Police found the car full of contraband, including a machine gun. So maybe Walker was on foot near the store or near his car and shot Officer Roosevelt twice after being called to Roosevelt's vehicle. Or maybe he had the rapid round shootout from his car and simply bailed out of the car after the shooting to head for the storm drains. Either way, neighbors heard the shooting and Roosevelt was rushed to the hospital where he later died, but after he gave his version of the events and described Walker to police. Officer Roosevelt's ability to give the description would prove to be Walker's undoing, but not for a while. Walker had killed Officer Roosevelt and escaped through the sewers and remained free, and now the police knew who they were looking for, or at least what he looked like. So what did Walker do with that reprieve? You might think he lay low as the storm drains and sewers. But no. From that June 1946 night through December 1946, Walker made more fake license plates, stole cars, and regularly robbed liquor stores. Remember how the June 1946 event with Officer Roosevelt would ultimately be Walker's undoing? Well, in December 1946, the police finally found Walker's apartment at 1831 and a half North Argyle Avenue, an address that no longer exists because that stretch of Argyle is now an on-ramp for the famed 101/Hollywood freeway and surrounded by office buildings. But back in 1946, on December 20, 3 detectives raided Walker's apartment on Argyle Avenue at 2 a.m. Walker, surprised in his sleep by the raid, reached for his machine gun and managed to grab it. There was a struggle over the gun. An officer shot Walker twice in the shoulder, and that was the end of Walker's crime spree. He had used the sewers of Los Angeles, countless roads traveled in stolen cars, contraband cash, and the dark of night to hide, but they finally caught him in his own apartment. He had just turned 29 in October. As he was handcuffed, Walker reportedly said, "All right now, you have me. Do a good job." In Walker's apartment, the police found guns and license plates, and nearby were 3 cars he had stolen, including one outfitted with a machine gun on the driver's side. Walker also told the arresting officers that just a week earlier, 2 motorcycle patrol officers had stopped him on Hollywood Boulevard for a minor traffic violation and let him go. He ominously and chillingly talked as though they had narrowly missed not making it out of that encounter if they had recognized him and tried to detain him. The arresting officers took Walker to the hospital for the gunshot wounds to his shoulder, and along the way, Walker confessed to all his crimes. After Walker's arrest, his parents revealed that the family had a long history of mental illness. At his trial, Walker pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, and his parents testified for him. The judge ultimately found him sane. He was found guilty of the murder of Officer Roosevelt and the attempted murder of the 2 officers who had staked out his stolen goods sale in April 1946, and with whom he had the shootout before he made his first escape through LA's sewers. He was sentenced to death for the murder of Officer Roosevelt and sent to San Quentin prison. After Walker exhausted his appeals in 1948, Walker's father committed suicide. Eventually, a psychiatrist diagnosed Walker with paranoid schizophrenia. Just 36 hours before his scheduled execution, Walker also attempted suicide. This led to a years-long postponement of his execution. He was sent to a maximum security mental hospital where he picked up the saxophone, and authorities labeled him a model prisoner. The hospital prison gave him privileges to walk around the prison guards, and using those privileges, he escaped. But authorities quickly recaptured him. Despite revoked privileges, he somehow re-established himself as a model prisoner, and the hospital prison allowed him to mentor younger delinquents. Later, the state transferred Walker back to state prison without warning. The governor commuted his death sentence to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Although Walker filed in the Supreme Court an unsuccessful petition for a writ of habeas corpus, the Supreme Court did strike the portion of Walker's sentence that denied him the possibility of parole. This meant parole was now possible for Walker. In 1974, at the age of 57, and after being incarcerated in some form for roughly 27 years, Walker was paroled. He reportedly immediately legally changed his name, likely an application in process before his parole was granted so that, if he was released on parole, he'd be ready on day 1 to begin life under a new name. It's just a hunch, but since a movie had been made about his criminal activity, he probably thought this was the only way to get a fresh start. He found a job as a chemist and disappeared into utter obscurity. We know close to nothing about his life after his 1974 release from prison. We do know, though, that he died in 2008, the day after he turned 91. He had been free for 34 years. If Walker's life reads a bit like a police procedural, Hollywood saw it that way too, which was rare for the time. When Eagle Lion Films made He Walked by Night, the company produced a film that focused on investigative techniques, which was unique for the time. But the lesser-known cast is what makes it work. It feels like a portrayal of real-life events because we don't see actors we recognize. As much as we love actors we know, the ability of a film with large players to achieve documentary overtones is much harder when we recognize the person who regularly plays characters in fictional stories. He Walked by Night rolls almost like a caught-on-tape movie. In some places, it even feels like we're watching security footage of a crime scene. The other bonus to the unknown cast and the docudrama style is that the movie includes Jack Webb of Dragnet fame, who was not well known in 1948, so he fit right in with the cast. In fact, his part in this film is somewhat small considering who he became career-wise. In He Walked by Night, you see the kernels of what would blossom into Jack Webb's trademark of always injecting a bit of the skeptic into his tone. By 1950, as an actor, he had made it into 3 well-regarded films in that year alone, including the excellent post-war film The Men, which starred Marlon Brando, the Elizabeth Scott noir Dark City, and famed Oscar-winning director Billy Wilder's Sunset Boulevard, with a stellar A-list cast that included William Holden, yes, that William Holden, Gloria Swanson, Cecil B. DeMille, and more. And it turns out that being on the set and watching the police procedural aspect of the way Eagle Lion Films crafted He Walked by Night gave Webb the idea for Dragnet. That's right, his being in this movie is how we got Dragnet. Webb launched Dragnet on radio a year after He Walked by Night in 1949. Then came his big film year in 1950, followed by his co-directing the 1954 film version of Dragnet. And then there was the TV show Dragnet that ran for years. More broadly and less about the cast, the film does a wonderful job of using the dark shadows of noir to give Richard Basehart a chilling edge while telling a stripped-down, short-and-to-the-point story. Strictly from a film appreciation and art standpoint, it's a good film and a cult classic that stands up to the best A-list films. Yes, it even competes with Hitchcock's Spellbound. Spellbound is mostly a talky psycho-thriller with the tension coming from the minds of the characters. He Walked by Night is also about one man almost fighting against himself, but the film brilliantly interweaves action and mental tension. I think that balance sets it apart from other low-budget noirs, which is somewhat redundant since noir was born out of lower film budgets and creating what you could with the lighting and cast available. Like other great noirs, He Walked by Night turned budget disadvantages into a fine classic. I highly recommend He Walked by Night. Thanks for watching.